And who are we talking about today?
We're talking about Bennigsen. I think the black sheep of the Russian Napoleonic generalship.
Right, because he wasn't Russian. He was from Hanover, right?
Exactly. He's well, in that sense, many of these Russian officers, right, are not necessarily ethnic Russians.
Right.
And Bennigsen is certainly one of them. He hails from Hanover. He was born in February of 1745.
Right.
Into this family that originally was from Hanover. He was born in Brunswick.
Right.
But his family was noble, and like all of these senior officers, nobility was an assumed thing.
Right. And we'll jump into his early childhood in just a moment. And I love talking about Hanoverians. Shout out to Life and Times of Frederick the Great podcast. I know they love all Hanover people. But before we do that, I know you're involved with the Massena Society, and I think my listeners would be interested in what that is. Could you talk briefly on that?
Oh, thank you so much. This is a society that was established several years ago. But it was established initially as a way to promote Napoleonic studies. And we called it Massena because a lot of us just shared the passion for studying the life and the exploits and good times of Napoleon's Marshal Victor André Massena.
Right.
In Napoleonic circles, of course, we have a long-standing debate about who was the best marshal.
Right. And it's interesting you picked Massena. He was like the least educated of all the marshals, and he kind of learned on the fly.
Oh, I know. I was I was the black sheep of that society because I was always proclaiming Davout, but they still accepted me. Maybe as a token.
Right.
But Massena Society is a society that is promoting academic study of Napoleonic era, and the members of it, we all kind of donate money and then provide scholarships for students, for graduate students to attend conferences, and most crucially, we offer 5 doctoral fellowships for PhD candidates to do research in archives. Some of that money can go for travel. So essentially, making sure that this field endures, that we have new generation coming up that sustains this research. So I've been the president of the society for the past 3 years, and I'm very passionate about this cause.
Yeah, it sounds very intriguing. So if I'm a young undergrad in European studies, is there a website I can go to?
Yes, if you know a student who's looking for funding his research or his or her research, massenasociety.org is our website, and there they can click on the fellowship tab where they will find the call for submissions for this current year, 23-24. We have, as I said, 5 fellowships, doctoral fellowships available. And on top of it, we also will sponsor their trip to one of the national academic conferences, either Society for Military History Conference, which will be in next year in Arlington, or the Consortium on Revolutionary Era, which is the premier organization for the Napoleonic period, which I actually will be hosting in Baton Rouge in February.
Interesting. Okay. So, yeah, thank you for mentioning that, massenasociety.org for all those that are interested. Okay. Well, let's jump into General Bennigsen. As we mentioned, he was born in Hanover to a noble family, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. Do you know anything about his upbringing?
Yes, we do. So Bennigsen, as I said, he's the black sheep of the Russian generalship, and that's true in many respects. One way is that we still don't have a good biography of him in Russian or in English or French or whichever language you choose. So he's been largely overlooked. I tried to fill that gap by working on a 2-volume set of his memoirs. The first
Mhm.
volume came out this year. The second one will be out next year. And as part of that project, I essentially wrote a lengthy article on describing his biography.
Mhm.
So when we look at his childhood, we realize that Bennigsen, in many respects, had no choice but to pursue a military career. Right?
Mhm.
His father, his grandfather, they were all military men. And himself, Bennigsen in 1805 wrote an interesting kind of reminiscence. And in that, he has a lovely quote where he says that I've been raised at the camp and grew up to the sounds of gunfire. Because his father had good connection, he was serving as a colonel in the Guards in Brunswick. Bennigsen was able to get an early start in his career. He's 10 years old when he's appointed as a page at the Hanoverian court. And then
Mhm.
4 years later, just 14 years old, he's commissioned in the Hanoverian Foot Guards. And so
Mhm.
he starts his career at what we consider now a teenager, right?
Mhm.
His baptism by fire is during 7 Years' War, this brutal conflict that will involve so many European countries. And by then, he's already a captain. And he established himself as a good, a kind of decent officer, young officer who distinguished himself, not necessarily distinguished in a way in enough to earn a rapid promotion to higher ranks, but certainly a reputation. A reputation that was strong enough that he was able to marry well.
Mhm.
He married to Baroness Steinberg. And then it happened so that by the time 7 Years' War ended, his father also dies, plus his marriage, which was quite kind of advantageous for him, meant that Bennigsen had enough money to retire.
Mhm.
So he right away after the war, he kind of says, "That's it. I've done my thing. I've seen the blood and gore. I know what the war is. Let me now get to my estate at a lovely estate at Bantown
Right.
in near Hanover, and I will just live myself my the rest of my life there."
Right.
And as often happens, I guess he was he loved living large.
Right. He got bored at the estates, I guess.
Well,
Yeah.
bored, but also he squandered his inheritance.
Oh no.
He squandered that money. His wife dies. This untimely death of his wife also cuts off the money that her family was providing, and so Bennigsen find himself kind of compelled to get back into doing the only thing really that he knew how to do, which is the military service. Um, he served briefly in Hanover, but realized there was not enough money there.
Mhm.
And so he looked around and decided to seek a career in Russia.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like he rose pretty quick through the ranks, but he was noble. And I guess he is real. After his unretirement, he fights against the Turks, which seems like there was always battles against the Turks over territory and other things at this time.
Yes, he arrives in Russia in 1773,
Mhm.
and he's accepted with the rank of a premier major in Russian service, sent to Vyatka Musketeer Regiment. But his first service is actually not against the Turks, but rather against the rebellious peasants as part of that great uprising that Emelian Pugachev organized in 1773-74.
Mhm.
So Bennigsen actually serves in the eastern part of Russian Empire, fights Pugachev's troops. As we all know, the uprising was brutally crushed. Pugachev was captured, brought to St. Petersburg and quartered. And it is during this campaign, which, by the way, was led by an individual that we'll be discussing, hopefully, at the next in the next episode, the famed Russian general Alexander Suvorov.
Oh yeah, I know that guy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Suvorov notices Bennigsen during this campaign, and it is his service against the Pugachev that essentially opens the pathway for Bennigsen's advancement. And he makes within just to give you a sense, he comes to Russia in 73, fights for the next year and a half against these peasants, and then he achieves the promotion quickly to a full major, and then lieutenant colonel by 79. So within 4 years, he's already lieutenant colonel.
Pretty good.
And if Russian service is weird in the sense that the listeners who listen to us discuss Kutuzov's career know that the officers could be moved from one branch of the military to another. So Kutuzov served in the light cavalry, in the light infantry, in regular infantry, in staff officer, right? And Bennigsen kind of starts his career as an infantry officer, but then in 79 he's actually transferred to the light cavalry, and there he remains for many years, kind of serving. And it is with that light cavalry, Izumsky Light Cavalry Regiment, that he actually participates in the war against the Turks. Once again, finds himself under command of Suvorov. Now, this time fighting in the Crimea, in the famous siege at Ochakov, and distinguishes himself enough to earn yet another promotion. This time to brigadier general,
right?
Which is not a shabby move, since in about 15 years, right? Since his arrival, he went from a major to a general. And this time, the 1787-1788 period is also kind of personal. From a personal point of view, Bennigsen endures yet another heartbreak, because he married second time after his wife passed away. He married second time. And his wife dies during childbirth. So he tries to console himself by throwing himself yet again in another marriage, a third one, and his wife also passed away.
Oh my
In
gosh!
1789. So within that period, right,
Terrible.
about 20 years, he loses 3 wives.
That's awful.
So on the personal level, it could not have but caused kind of a depression, or kind of a soul searching at the very least.
Yep.
He has a small child, a boy, Adam, who is born in 76. But so in this sense, Bennigsen has to juggle raising this boy and being deployed, on campaign for long periods of time.
Right. Well, like you said, he works his way up the ranks, and in the 1790s, it seems like he's, doing well again, distinguishing himself on a couple fronts. Where's his career kind of leading towards? Like, do you think he's going to be in charge of? Maybe he knows, like, hey, I'm the smartest guy here. I'm going to work my way all the way to the top.
This is kind of one of the ways I think we need to kind of approach him, is maybe to consider how contemporaries perceived him, because it's one thing to kind of look at his career advancement, but the contemporaries were rather divided in assessing him. Napoleon's aide-de-camp, Philippe Ségur, actually met Bennigsen in December of 1806, right in the midst of that brutal winter campaign. And he describes him as a pale, withered individual of high stature, cold appearance, with a scar across his face. And we know that the French, the Russians, right, people who came across him, all spoke of him as a brave officer who showed martial prowess, who had the reputation from his struggle against the Ottomans, and then in 1790s against the Poles, an officer with brave officer with some ability to lead the regiments, but struggling at operational and strategic level. And I think that is one of the big issues kind of dealing with Russian officers, is that many of them are very good at on tactical level, but they struggle at the operational and then strategic level, and Bennigsen is certainly one of them. Even Robert Wilson, the British commissioner, who was attached to the Russian army in 1806 and then in 1812.
Right.
So Wilson also speaks of Bennigsen as this is a quote, a most gallant and good man in every sense of this word. But then he goes on to observe, and this is a quote, that he was not a great officer. However, an officer in this sense implies that he had difficulty comprehending these grand tactics, right, the great operational maneuvers, in that oftentimes he was kind of thrown out of his kind of comfort zone by the fast pace of the war. The contemporaries, there is a wonderful memoir that I've translated partially, and hopefully it will be published later on, by a Russian officer. Bulgarian has a great description of Bennigsen. So if you indulge me, it's a nice quote.
Sure.
So this is what Bulgarian writes in his memoirs. He was brave and enterprising, but if one considers that his main accomplishments came as a detachment commander against some Polish confederates, that is, rebellious nobility, and some small number of regular troops who tended to be inexperienced, poor armed, and led by men with limited understanding of the war, then Bennigsen's former successes could not have served as sufficient guarantees of future victories, especially in any war involving such masters as Napoleon. Yet everyone recognized that Bennigsen had a broad knowledge,
right,
that although he had not had a classical education due to his enlisting in the army at an early age, he had still acquired a thorough understanding of war through reading, thinking, and practicing. Nature created him as a warrior, endowed him with a passionate love for the art of war, quickness of mind, military eye, extraordinary courage, rare audacity, and remarkable composure. And I love how it creates a portrait of him, of a man, right?
Yeah.
That gives us both his flaws and his strength.
Yeah, and that's an interesting quote. That is a nice portrait of the man. Transition from that to what is probably the darkest part of his career. In 1798, he's fired from military service by Tsar Paul I, allegedly because of his connections to Platon Zubov. I'll let you take it from there when I wrap up next, because yeah,
that is a good. This is where we get into the area.
It's like a soap opera.
Oh yes, I think so. It certainly would be a soap opera I would love to watch. Emperor Paul comes to power in November of 1796 after his mother, Catherine the Great, passes away. And we know that Catherine had lovers, and her last favorite, or kind of last lover, was this young gentleman by the name of Platon Zubov. And Bennigsen was indeed associated with Zubov brothers. So we have two brothers, Platon and Valerian. And Bennigsen was involved with the Zubovs, especially the Valerian Zubov, and he, in fact, served under Zubov against the Persians in 1796. So that's the campaign that Catherine started, and then Paul, upon coming to power, quickly canceled and recalled the troops. And so when Bennigsen comes back from the Caucasus, he realizes that much has changed in St. Petersburg with this change of the ruler, and that Paul is keen on bringing order, accountability, and discipline. And Paul does it in a very kind of radical way, where he begins a massive purge of a Russian officer corps, which was bloated. It had way too many officers serving. You had hundreds of generals when there were jobs for just a few dozen, right? So there's a top-heavy officer corps. And Paul, rightly so, begins purging it. Having said that, I do want to point out that in any purge, when you talk about these mass-scale firings, there will be individuals who are caught in this purge, in this firing, that whose case should have been probably reconsidered. And there is a way to argue in favor of Bennigsen by saying that, hey, he was a capable officer. But if we look over his career, right, and this is where Bulgarian's quote, I think, helps us, is that if we look at over his career, he doesn't have that distinguished moment yet, right? Who did he fight against? He fought against rebellious peasants led by Pugachev. Then he fought briefly against the Turks. And then he fought against what Bulgarian refers to as the Polish rebellious nobility. So there is no moment where he really shines.
Right.
And that's why in Paul, essentially in October of 1798, fires him. Because there are many other officers like Bennigsen in the army, and so he's gone. But of course, from Bennigsen's point of view, I mean, this is his livelihood. I mean, he came to Russia in search of job, in search of income,
right?
And all that now is in jeopardy. And so, unsurprisingly, 2 years later, Bennigsen joins a conspiracy against the Tsar, and not just joins, right, but rather he actually is one of the leaders of this conspiracy.
Yeah, he's a leading figure in it. Yeah.
And one of the reasons for it is because he has this reputation for audacity and courage. Because if you're going to try to kill a divinely blessed monarch, you'll need a lot of audacity.
Yeah, you better go 100%. No,
that's right. And so shortly after midnight on March 24, 1801, Emperor Paul had a lovely dinner attended by Kutuzov and others. When he retires that night to his bedroom, a group of about 60 officers, led by Zubov brothers, led by the chief of police of St. Petersburg, led by local kind of governor, and by Bennigsen, quietly enter the royal residence. It's a lovely castle that Paul actually built in order to be better protected. Ironic. Interestingly, that night, as they were preparing for this conspiracy, young men who were involved in it are kind of getting jittery and concerned, and Bennigsen finds a solution for their anxiety. He gives them alcohol, right? Fortifies them with alcohol.
Yeah, steal their courage.
That's right. You need that courage, and oftentimes we know once we consume alcohol, we do some silly things.
Yeah.
But even then, as these officers enter the palace, and they start searching for the emperor, they go into his bedroom and they found it empty. So imagine that panic.
Yeah.
Right? Here they are inside the palace. They crossed that line, right? They crossed the Rubicon.
Rubicon is right.
And the emperor is nowhere to be found. And so they are standing in this room, all panicking. Some of them are already kind of bewailing, crying. They're like, that's it. The emperor probably realized we were coming and we will be all arrested and executed for treason. When Bennigsen kind of goes around and grabs them by the uniform and shakes them, and he famously says, "The wine has been poured. We all must drink it now." Right? That's it, right? We cannot go back.
That's a great line.
And so they search the room a bit better, and that's when they notice Tsar's little feet sticking out behind the curtains in the corner of the room. They dragged the emperor out, demanded that he sign the document of abdication. He refused, and then we have a scuffle in which Paul is badly beaten. Several men overpower him. Some bang his head on the floor. Others threw a sash around his neck and strangled him. What Bennigsen did exactly inside that room remains to be kind of unclear. Yeah. But the fact that he was in the room, right, he was one of the leaders of it, and yet this murder, right, paved the way for Paul's son, Emperor Alexander, to come to power. And despite his role in the conspiracy, Bennigsen's career did not suffer under this new emperor.
Yeah, it's almost made better. Like he got his job back and goes through the ranks. Like he rises.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the assassination takes place in March, and in July, the new emperor appoints Bennigsen military governor of Vilna, modern-day Vilnius, essentially the governor general or military governor of Lithuania, and then gives him also the position of the inspector of Lithuanian inspection, which was like a division, administrative division of the Russian army.
Right.
Furthermore, within a year of the assassination, Bennigsen is promoted to a full general, and his seniority is backdated to 3 years earlier. So effectively, Alexander negates the firing, negates all the time that Bennigsen lost in being unemployed. So that is, to me, is a really interesting way for Alexander to navigate this political kind of military labyrinth in the wake of the assassination of his father. Right? He exiles some of the leaders who were in conspiracy, but he understands that he needs also men like Bennigsen, so he keeps him around.
Right. By this time, Napoleon's first council, 1804, 1805, he's emperor, and he's kind of moving his armies across Europe. You know, he beats the Austrians and Russians in 1805 at Austerlitz, the Prussians in 1806, but the Prussians don't surrender immediately, and Russia is there helping the Prussians. What kind of happens? How does Bennigsen get command of the army at Pultusk?
So in 1805, when the war began, the War of Third Coalition, Russia mobilized several armies for the struggle against Napoleon. We usually concentrate on the army of Podolia that Kutuzov commanded, and that's the one that marched all the way to Bavaria and then discovered that Austrians were destroyed at turned and retreated to Olmütz, and then rallied, right, and fought at Austerlitz. But in addition to that army, Russians prepared 2 other armies, including the so-called Army of the North of about 50,000 men. That was commanded by Bennigsen. And that army was supposed to kind of nudge the Prussians out of neutrality. If you read the letters that Emperor Alexander writes to Bennigsen, he essentially says, hey, you got to demand from Prussians the right to pass through their territory, because that will will force them to do something. They will either allow us to pass, and therefore you will be able to help us fight against Napoleon, or they will refuse, and then you have to, he actually gives Bennigsen the right to forcibly kind of go through. So essentially, Bennigsen's task was to bring pressure on Prussians. But that did not happen. Bennigsen was unable to join the war because, as we know, Alexander went to Berlin, negotiated with Frederick William of Prussia, and the agreement was that they will first offer Napoleon a mediation, Prussian mediation, and then if Napoleon refused, then Prussia will join the war and let Bennigsen's army pass through. And we know that the mediator, the Prussian envoy, arrived to Austerlitz essentially the day after the battle. So by that time, Russian and Austrians are already destroyed, and therefore there is not much to mediate. So Bennigsen remains therefore in charge of the army that already been gathered between Tarogen and Grodno, so what is today Lithuania, and he stayed there until late 1806, when the War of the Fourth Coalition began, and Russia was supposed to support Prussians. So that the war started really rapidly. The events unfolded at a pace that no one expected. The war begins on October 8, and by October 14, Napoleon destroys the Prussian army. So the Russians were simply unprepared for that kind of rapid turn of events. Which means that by the time Prussians were destroyed, Bennigsen was still on the border of Russian Empire. Now, by this time, the army that he has been reorganized into 2 corps, 2 strong corps. One is commanded by Bennigsen, and the other one is given by a General Friedrich Wilhelm von Buxhoevden, of Swedish ancestry.
Mhm.
And so here then Alexander sends Bennigsen and Bukov then to kind of help what's left of Prussia resist Napoleon. But there are problems. One problem is that Napoleon is moving too fast for the Russians. So even while Russians are passing through what used to be Polish countryside, Napoleon already has taken Berlin and is actually by late November in the former Polish capital of Warsaw. So Russians are simply confronted by the fact that Napoleon's speed is too great for them to match. But more crucially, there is confusion. There's disorder within the Russian army because Bennigsen and Bukov then really don't like each other.
Right.
So they have, on the personal level, animosity, but there is also professional rivalry. There are questions of seniority. In any military, the seniority matters. And of course, here we deal with individuals who, on top of seniority, there are matters of noble kind of ancestry, kind of personal
ego.
Status, ego, exactly. And so, because we have two corps and they're kind of independent corps, neither of them are willing to listen to the other. And yet, Emperor Alexander, fails to appoint an overall commander. So you would say, why, right?
Yeah.
And as a contemporary officer, and actually very interesting officer, Konstantin Benkendorf, who wrote one of the most fascinating memoirs of this time, remarked in his kind of diary memoir, he says it was difficult to find a commander-in-chief. And I think sometimes people are surprised, why would they be difficult to find? Well, the obvious choice, let's say, for the commander-in-chief, Kutuzov, the man who commanded the Russian army in the last war against Napoleon, the man who properly and correctly assessed the way to fight Napoleon, only to be ignored and overruled by the Tsar. Well, that man is in disgrace, right? Alexander is unwilling to give him a second chance. If you look at the remaining generals, most of them are junior in rank in terms of seniority to Bukov and Bennigsen. And so Alexander could have appointed one of them, but he instead chose, and I still struggle to kind of understand why he went with this choice. He instead decided to recall from retirement Mikhail Kamensky.
Right.
Kamensky, I mean, here we talk about a man who is nearly 70 years old.
Past his
The last time he fought was in 7 Years' War.
Yeah.
I mean, much has happened since 7 Years' War.
And he's mentally unstable, as we find out later.
Exactly. He's senile. I mean, he's in poor health. In fact, if you read his own letters, Kamensky's letters to the Tsar, he writes things like, this is a quote, "I almost completely lost my vision, and I am unable to find any places on the map." I mean, that in itself should have been a red flag to the Tsar. Like,
right.
Who am I sending? He can't even read the map.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And immediately he realizes that, I mean, this is more that he's signed up for. I mean, the pace of the war is different. The challenges, logistical challenges, are at the level that he's unaccustomed to. And remember, he has been in retirement for the past decade, actually more than decade. So he's not used to these challenges.
Yeah, warfare has changed. Absolutely.
And so he does the next best thing, and that is he quits. Less than a week after arriving, he quits.
Probably a good thing that he did. So the Pultusk battle, and obviously we have Eylau coming up, but they do all right there. Marshal Lannes, who's one of Napoleon's best, wins the battle, but it's not a rout of any kind.
So your Francophilia is screaming, my friend. What do you mean he won the battle?
He won the battle. Yeah.
Bennigsen certainly disagrees with you.
Okay.
Because Bennigsen claimed both of these battles as Russian victories because they retained control of the battlefield until they decided to leave, right?
Right.
And I think that's where, from the Russian perspective, French were on attackers. All their attacks were rebuffed. They retained the control of the field and then chose to leave it and retreat, right? And this is where we can get into the long debate whether control of the battlefield is the sufficient grounds for claiming victory or not. But as far as Russians were concerned, certainly at this time in December and January, December of 1806 and January of 1807, and even later, they all considered Pultusk and Golymin as bloody battles, but ones that they did well. That these were not defeats by far.
All right.
But that, of course, the problem is that they're fighting in an area that is poor, that lacks roads.
Horrible weather.
Right, yeah. It's a horrible weather. That's right. It's It's a December, January. It's a winter, high snow, cold, and that means the logistical system essentially implodes on both sides. And by the time we get to February, both French and the Russians have suffered enough from this war, but they fight the decisive battle right at Prussisch Eylau. Which is a 2-day battle on February 7 and 8. And I would go and say that it's not really a battle, it's a bloodbath. Right?
Yeah.
It's
and I'll give you that one. That one was a draw.
You're seeing the light here.
Yeah, I've seen the light on that one. And Napoleon probably would have lost. His center was caving in. He was only saved by Marshal Murat's cavalry charge.
To Napoleon's kind of let me now play your side of it.
Sure.
Of course, the French have a big of a challenge in this battle because they're attacking a side that has dug in. Right, so it's not that Bennigsen fights a rather imaginative battle. It's not. For Bennigsen's point of view, it's a battle of attrition. He digs in and he tries to hold off the kind of repetitive series of attacks by the French. And we know that in that sense, Napoleon made the mistake of launching those straight-on attacks. It didn't help that we have a blizzard. We know what happens to Augereau's corps, right? Which marches in through the blizzard towards the Russian positions, lost its way and stumbles upon the main battery that Bennigsen set up in the middle of his position, which obliterates Augereau's corps in a matter of about 15 minutes. The corps is largely destroyed. But by the end of the battle, Bennigsen is convinced that he was able to rebuff Napoleon himself. So unlike Pultusk or Golymin, where we talk about one of Napoleon's subordinates, right, one of the marshals or generals, here we talk about Napoleon himself in charge. And considering the previous, essentially, 8 years of Napoleon's success, I think of Lodi, Rivoli, Austerlitz, Jena, right, and then to be able to stop him,
right,
I think was of such elation, certainly for Bennigsen, that he writes that famous report in which he says, "We won.
Yeah,
we defeated him. We captured prisoners. We captured 12 flags." Emperor Alexander is astonished. He's just jubilant. He asks for those 12 flags to be delivered, and Bennigsen says, "We misplaced them." Who hasn't done that, John?
Yeah.
But the news was still celebrated, right? Never mind that the flags were never produced. They were like, let's celebrate it anyways.
Yeah. And he's awarded the Order of St. Andrew, the highest order in the Russian Empire. And things are looking good for Bennigsen until a few months later.
Well, yes, you're right. But I do want to point that Eylau is a bloodbath, right?
It is, yeah.
To borrow from Ney, right? He says, "What a massacre!"
Yeah, without result. Yeah,
and then there's another eyewitness who says, "What a horrible butchery of men this was."
Yeah.
From Jean-Baptiste Barré, a participant on the French side, and the extent to which the Russian army suffered, right, and the Bennigsen's kind of unimaginative orders, both before, during, and after the battle, meant that there were a lot of senior Russian officers who are not happy with him, to the extent that one of them actually challenges him to a duel. Robert Wilson, the man I mentioned a few minutes ago, the British commissioner, actually writes a letter at this time, in 3 days after the battle. He writes a letter, and he says, and this is a quote: "Bennigsen is unpopular in the army. His enemies do not form their opinion from a due appreciation of his qualities, but they are hurried into prejudice by the false feeling that their national glory has been obscured by this mismanagement that they accuse Bennigsen of." Bennigsen actually writes a letter to Alexander, tries to respond to these accusations, and he offers to resign his command. Alexander says, no, stay in charge. We need you. But that the kind of the feeling of the animosity remains. And especially this is true about Bennigsen's relationship with one of the commanders by the name of Osten-Sacken. The Osten-Sacken can't stand Bennigsen, and that becomes an important issue when the campaign resumes in late spring. Right? We know that after Eylau, there was a lull in the campaign, and then in late May, Bennigsen thinks he has a chance to defeat Napoleon's army. He looks at the scout reports, and he realizes that Marshal Ney's corps is isolated, or it looks like it's isolated near Gutstadt. And so he tries to destroy Ney's corps by this kind of coordinating a multi-column assault on Ney. And the plan, and I've looked at it many times and kind of tried to reason, it's not a good plan. And again, this is where we can kind of hold him responsible.
Right.
But it's also that some of the column commanders are also responsible for not doing their best to fulfill this plan. In fact, one of them, this Osten-Sacken, the guy who really disliked Bennigsen, is given a crucial task of leading one of the striking columns, and he arrives too late. So Osten-Sacken claims that he was facing logistical challenges, right? Poor road, transports to carry, and all. But was it also kind of deliberate way for him to undermine an operation that would result in removal of his rival? Right? That my gut feeling is that maybe, but I don't have the clear evidence for it. But in any case, the operation at Gutstadt is a failure.
Yeah.
Ney's corps fights brilliantly, organizes this fighting retreat. In fact, for those of you who are interested, look at this operation as a good example of what Napoleonic corps system is capable of.
Right. And Ney was probably one of the best on defense that Napoleon had.
That's right. And so he's able to organize fighting retreat, crosses the Pasarga River, buys enough time for Napoleon to swing into action. This Bataillon Carré, this massive rest of the army swings by, and Bennigsen now confronted with the fact that he needs to fight Napoleon at the positions that were not necessarily good for him. So he tries to retreat. So he retreats from Gutstadt to Heilsberg, where they fight a battle on June 10. And once again, it's not an imaginative battle.
It's bloodbath, another one.
That's right. Bennigsen even digs in deeper than at Eylau. He actually builds a dozen earthworks, kind of small fortifications, where his troops are holding ground against these repeated attacks by the French. But here, what we realize is that by the time he's fighting Heilsberg, we see the pressure, the physical toll of the campaign really exhausting Bennigsen. And we know that he's suffering from a kidney problems. He probably hasn't slept in days, right? And all that does affect him. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because when we get Heilsberg is forward on June 10.
Yep.
They retreat from Heilsberg towards a small town called Friedland.
Yeah.
When they get to Friedland, Bennigsen is utterly exhausted, and so he wants to rest.
Right.
So he makes that fateful mistake of moving the army across the river, right, from the eastern side of the river to the western side, so he can stay inside the city. And it is while in the city that he receives the news there is a French unit close enough, and so he decides to kind of score a quick victory,
Yeah,
because
Marshall.
Heilsberg is anything but victory.
Yeah, Marshal Lannes advance corps. Yeah.
And so he wants something to write about to the Tsar and say, hey, don't worry about Heilsberg. We were not defeated, and we were not defeated because, hey, here we have we fought the battle at Friedland and we won. And so he sends the troops to engage Lannes, and the rest is history.
Right. And I know as little about military tactics as anyone, but I do know that you should never fight a battle with the river at your back.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially I mean, you can fight maybe with the river in the back if you have enough bridges. But if you only have one permanent bridge and several pontoon bridges for an army of that size, yeah, that's a big problem. And the other officers realized it, and they cautioned Bennigsen. But he, as I mentioned, he was convinced that this will be a quick in and out. And it was anything. And again, this is a clear example of the superiority of the French system, because as we know, Lannes held ground. Napoleon arrives in the afternoon with the rest of his army and pounces on Bennigsen's troops. And by the end of the day, the battle is a decisive victory for the French. So Bennigsen stays in command through the summer, but after that kind of series of knockout punches that he took on his chin, it's hard to justify his employment. So while others are given command of the armies in Finland or against the Turks, Bennigsen stays largely unemployed for the next few years. But that, from a historian's point of view, that is a great advantage, because from 1807 to 1812, while at his home, while recovering from the physical exhaustion and all the impact of the career of this campaign, Bennigsen was determined to explain his decisions. He wanted to explain his side of the story, and therefore he wrote a series of long letters to his best friend, General Alexander von Foch. And in those letters, he kind of gives his vision, his view, his side. And those letters effectively form a memoir of this campaign, which, fortunately for your readers, I've translated, and it's now available in English.
I was looking at that. The memoirs, are they like Marshall McDonald's, where they're kind of inflating his importance and beautifying the facts, or you think they're pretty accurate?
I think there are all these memoirs, and certainly in Bennigsen's case, are self-serving, right? They're trying to explain in a good way, in the best way possible, the decisions they made. So yes, that we should always bear in mind, that all of this is self-serving. But what I like about his memoirs is kind of two things. One is he tries to rationalize his decision making, and I think it's an important way of kind of getting an insight into how a commander makes decisions. But the second important thing is that we know that during this campaign, Russians captured a lot of French correspondents, and especially Marshal Ney's corps was usually the victim of it. And Bennigsen incorporates dozens of Ney's letters and letters he receives from Napoleon and Berthier into his memoir. So this is another way to look at the source, is that it's not just Bennigsen's view of the side of it, but it's also the French side through captured correspondence.
Right. That's interesting. Okay. Well, we'll come back to those memoirs in a bit on his legacy. As you said, he's somewhat recovering until 1812, where Napoleon famously invades Russia. He's present at the huge battle of Borodino outside of Moscow. And then after the French capture Moscow, he's involved with defeating Murat at the engagement of Tarantino. I do want to talk about his quarrel with Kutuzov, who was the commander-in-chief. Do you want to touch base on that?
Oh, yes. So Bennigsen is unemployed when the war begins. So actually, on that night, when the French crossed the river and invaded Russia, Bennigsen was hosting this remarkable ball, this kind of a great dinner at his lovely estate on the outskirts of Vilna. In fact, in the state that one contemporary described as the small Versailles. And it is there, while celebrating, that the news arrive that the war has started.
Right.
And yet Bennigsen is unemployed. It is only later, when the Russians are already at Smolensk, that Alexander decides to kind of shake up the leadership, right? And he appoints my guy, General Kutuzov, as the commander-in-chief of all Russian armies. So
Right.
not just the 2 armies that are at Smolensk, but all Russian armies, and then sends Bennigsen as his chief of staff. Here, the relationship between these 2 men is fascinating. On one hand, they've known each other for many, many, many years.
Right.
They've served together against the Turks, so they've known each other for better part of 30 plus years. They know each other, they spend time with each other's families. I've looked at the Kutuzov's kind of letters to his wife's letters back, and it's clear that they enjoyed his company. But then when the war begins in 1812 and Bennigsen arrives, they disagree on the strategy. Right? Bennigsen wanted to a more forceful confrontation, kind of stand the ground and fight. And Kutuzov was more methodical. I mean, this is all through his entire career. He always talked about the need for a kind of contemplation, for need for a rational assessment. And Kutuzov wanted this prolonged war of attrition.
Right.
And the 2 men disagreed, and Bennigsen openly intrigued to have Kutuzov removed from power. And that kind of really soured the relationship. And it's heartbreaking to really look at the letters that Kutuzov is writing in the fall of 1812, where increasingly you see their friendship crumbling. And Kutuzov increasingly looks at Bennigsen not as a friend and kind of a professional rival, but now as an enemy.
Right.
And so in late fall, Kutuzov simply removes him from power, sends him packing from the army. And so that's where kind of the 2 men part their ways. Bennigsen will make a comeback in December of 1812 when Kutuzov actually wins the war, brings the army to the border.
Right.
And they're celebrating in Vilna, and Kutuzov realizes that Tsar wants to take all the credit. The Tsar comes to Vilnius, sidelines Kutuzov, and replaces all of his men with men of his choosing, and one of these men is Bennigsen.
Right. Now,
and of course, Kutuzov then dies soon enough.
Right.
Gets sick, and the relationship was never healed.
Yeah, that's unfortunate after all those years. But Bennigsen's recalled and placed at the head of an army and participates in the battles of Bautzen and Lutzen during the German War of Liberation. Those don't go very well.
No, but notice what is the army that Bennigsen is given. And I think this is where the quote that I used from Bulgarian, right, in terms of kind of limitations that Bennigsen had, is worth kind of bearing in mind, that Bennigsen is given the army that is kind of reserve army. So it is not the army that Barclay de Tolly is given. It's not the army that Blucher is leading. Bennigsen is kept in a second tier. It's his memory of his underperformance in 1806, 1807. Let me quote Alexander Langeron, a really capable general who serves with Bennigsen in 1813. And so Langeron, and his memoirs are available in French, so I encourage your listeners to read them. He has a lengthy passage on Bennigsen. And from that passage, I'll just cite a couple of interesting moments. Langeron thought that Bennigsen was, quote, an excellent general, but weak when in charge, for he knew nothing of how to make himself obeyed or how to repress intrigues that were taking place inside the headquarters. And so here again, Bennigsen is confronted with, challenges of conducting a war, of dealing with the officers who are increasingly kind of critical of him, and therefore he's kept in kind of more on the second line. So we can't say that 1813 is a great campaign for him. Look what he's kind of the hallmark of this campaign is that the fact that he served at Hamburg, isn't it?
Yeah, and Leipzig too. He was there as well. But yeah, the siege of Hamburg. Let's touch on that briefly. Napoleon's pulling back, but he wants to have strongholds throughout Europe. When I guess he thinks he's going to defeat the Allied armies, so he can go back to Hamburg, which he leaves under Marshal Davout, who is probably, if not the best, one of the best, but the best marshals that he has. And this turns into a year-long siege that Bennigsen is up against one of the best. Do you think that's, I guess it's not it's a victory overall, but do you think it was a setback for Bennigsen that he didn't capture it sooner?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Davout holds it even after Napoleon's downfall. He refuses to let go.
Exactly. So it's not that Bennigsen necessarily defeated him, right?
Yeah.
So and then that is again, from Bennigsen's point of view, of course, he would have loved to be part of the army of invasion in France. He would have loved to be part of the force that was fighting on the plains of Champagne, taking Paris, and all those generals were raking in the rewards and promotions and orders. And here he is stuck in Hamburg on this prolonged siege where he's not making any headway. So by the end of it, I think he's quite chagrined. He's quite saddened.
Yeah.
And so he retires almost as soon as the war is over. He stays kind of in different commands until 1818, and then he retires and spends the rest of his life at his estate. He actually leaves Russia and goes to his Hanoverian estate at Bantel. But unfortunately, these last few years of his life were kind of sad and poignant because he suffers from ailments. He went blind, and I think, and he essentially, spent these last few months in miserable state.
Yeah, and he passes in it's like 1826, 8 years after he really retired. What do you think the legacy is? Because like I just did a Twitter poll to see who everyone thought the best commander of the Russian army was during the Napoleonic times. He's up there, but I don't. Is he the best, or what do you think his legacy is?
His legacy is that I think he had the misfortune of facing Napoleon. Right? If he had fought in a different campaign, maybe against the Ottomans, where he is actually commanding an army, or if, like Kutuzov did, like Bagration did, like Suvorov did, I think his reputation would have been far bigger than it is. But the great kind of moment of his career is, of course, 1806, 1807. And there, on one hand, he performs well. Right? He's not crushed like Prussians are in 1806. He's not crushed like Austrians are in at Marengo or at Austerlitz. But it is that Eylau is the bloodbath, and there's not much to show from a commander's point of view, right? There's not much ingenuity shown there, and of course the catastrophic mistake he makes at Friedland costs Russian army thousands of casualties. This is where I look at him more as a middle of the way kind of guy, right? Capable at a tactical level. Probably you want him as a in charge of a corps, but nowhere near the command of an army, nowhere near the decision making on a strategic level.
Yeah, he certainly had bravery and courage, but it's kind of a up and down career and personal life as well.
And here's the thing: the contemporaries knew that, and there's the lovely quote from one of the memoirs that. And this is, if I'm again, I need to remember it properly, but I think that the quote says that Bennigsen nurtured inordinate ambition within himself, and that ambition, I think, oftentimes got the best of him, and that is especially true in 1812. Right, that it is that ambition that he could do things better than Kutuzov that burns him.
Right.
If he had stayed on the better side of Kutuzov, he might have done better. And I think the best example of it is the events at Tarutino, or the Battle of Vinkovo, as it is known in the French historiography, where the a falling out between Kutuzov and Bennigsen results in a partial success. Right. Bennigsen wants an all-out attack. Kutuzov refuses to support it because he fears that it might cause Napoleon to leave Moscow and prematurely.
Right.
As I said, Kutuzov has this vision of a war of attrition, a strategic view. Bennigsen wants a local success. He wants to hammer Murat and kind of defeat him.
Right.
And Kutuzov tries to argue that that small victory that can be gained at Tarutino is not worth it if it will force Napoleon to leave too early.
Right. Right.
Then Bennigsen actually organizes a group of officers and forced Kutuzov into action, but Kutuzov then does the half-hearted support. So at the crucial moment when Bennigsen asks for reinforcements, Kutuzov stands his foot down, refuses to commit, and Murat gets away.
Yeah. Yeah, and we were talking about that at Friedland and Eylau, like when Bennigsen's subordinates are basically not doing what he wants, he's now the subordinate not doing what Kutuzov wants.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I recommend my listeners check out the memoirs of Bennigsen, right? I think that's good learning right there.
Absolutely. The volume 1, the Confronting Napoleon, is already available, and I'm almost done editing the second volume. I think it offers a really kind of good insight into this campaign, especially if you do wargaming, if you do kind of reenactment of this campaign. Bennigsen has many interesting insights to offer.
Indeed. Well, thank you, my friend, for joining the show once again. If you guys want to follow Alex on Twitter, Mikaberidze on Twitter, and his books or anywhere books are sold, I recommend any of his books. They're fascinating. And it was good having you back on the show, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me. Look forward to talking to you again.